Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. So in part A of this week, our focus is going to be loops and libraries and modules. Specifically with loops, we are going to talk about for loops and nested loops. And then when we talk about libraries and modules, we'll talk about the math module. And then for part B this week, we'll talk about another module called the turtle module, which is really cool, so get excited for that. Alright, so let's go ahead and start talking about loops. So a loop is another sort of building block that you can use in your code to make it more powerful. It's specifically a structure that lets you repeat code. So it's a repetition structure that causes a statement or a set of statements, so some number of lines of code, to run some number of times. It repeats itself. It's like when you have your music on a loop, right? The songs repeat. Same sort of idea. So let's talk about why we are going to use loops at all. So this example is a kind of silly program. It has a bunch of print statements and it will display the numbers 1 through 10 in order, 1 on each line. That said, while that will work, there are several reasons why you maybe shouldn't do that. One, it makes the program really large, right? That had 10 print lines. What if you wanted to print 10,000 numbers one at a time, one per line for some reason, right? Your program would start to get really large really fast. It can also be time consuming to write. You know, even if I copy and paste each line, I have to go in and change each number manually one at a time in those print statements. And it can take longer to debug or change. So, you know, if there's a problem with one of the print statements, maybe you decide you want to format it so that it ends with, you know, a different character instead of the default new line character, you'd have to go in and change every single line. So hopefully you can see why doing something like this might not be ideal. Generally, if you're going to be repeating the same code over and over, you're instead going to want to use a loop. So in this course, we're going to talk about two types of loops. We will talk about for loops, and we will talk about while loops. We won't talk about while loops until next week. So this week, we'll just talk about for loops. While loops, we'll talk about later. Alright, so here is an example of a for loop. So the way a for loop works is you have the word for, and then some variable, and then the word in, and then you have to give it some sequence of numbers, and we'll talk about what this range thing does in a minute. But the takeaway from this slide is that these two pieces of code, this one with all those print statements that we talked about before, and this other piece of code that is just 2 lines long, they both essentially display the same thing. They will both display the numbers 1 through 10, 1 on each line on the screen. So again, for all the reasons that I mentioned before, the code that is only 2 lines long is much better code. Alright, so this is the general form of what a for loop looks like. So you have the word for, that's how Python knows, okay, for loop is coming. That's one of these Python keywords. And then you have a variable. Now this is a variable that you haven't necessarily defined yet, so this can be a new variable as long as it, you know, goes by the standard variable naming rules and guidelines we've talked about. The word in, this is another one of those Python keywords. For and in are both Python words. And then some sequence, and we'll talk about the sequence more in a bit. And then at the end of this first line where you have for variable in sequence, you have a colon. So it's kind of like those function definition lines, right, where you have def, function name, so on, colon, and then whatever statements you want inside of your for loop, just like whatever statements you want inside of your function definitions, you put right underneath and you indent them over. So very similar sort of form to your function definitions. So in this general form, sequence here, it's some sequence of values in a specific order. And again, we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then variable gets assigned whatever these values are in this sequence one at a time. So it goes through each value one at a time until it goes through every single value in the sequence. And each time variable gets one of those new values, the statements inside the for loop go. So potentially these statements are running multiple times. Alright, so let's talk about what this range thing is doing. So this was the previous example, right? We have one piece of code, which is a little bit bulky, 10 lines of code just to display 10 numbers, versus our nice 2-line piece of code with our for loop. Now this for loop is using something called a range function. So this is one of those built-in functions to Python. It is a value returning function. Specifically, range gives you a sequence of integers. So in this example, the integers that it gives you is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And no, that 11 is not a typo. I'll talk about why it's for num in range 1, 11, even though we're just printing the numbers 1 through 10. So then again, every single time the loop runs, so again, the idea of a loop is that it runs multiple times, it repeats the code that's inside of it. Every single time this loop runs, a couple things happen. The variable num gets the next value in the sequence. So num starts with the value 1, then it gets the value 2, then it gets the value 3, and so on. And then, each time that happens, you print whatever num is. So again, first time it goes, num gets 1, and you print 1. Next time it goes, num gets 2, and you print 2, and so on. So again, this range function, this is a built-in function in Python, and it returns a sequence of integers. Alright, so let's talk about how you determine what numbers to put inside those parentheses. So again, those numbers in the parentheses, those are the arguments. Remember we talked about functions last week? This is a function called a range, so the values you put inside the parentheses, these are arguments. So range is a little bit of a special function in that it accepts 1, 2, or 3 arguments, which is pretty cool. So for example, if you give range one argument, one number, one value, 5, for example, for n in range 5, that will give you the sequence that will give you the sequence 0, not 1. It starts at 0. Remember how I talked about computers start counting at 0? This is what's going to start happening in this class. So range by default will start at 0, and then it'll do 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's a little bit weird. Even though I said for n in range 5, the variable n will get the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it stops at 4. It does not get the value 5, which I know is a little bit strange. The reason why it does that is because 1, computers start counting at 0, and 2, if you count the number of values we have, right, we have the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that is 5 values. So the idea is when that for loop goes, it will run 5 times because n will get 5 different values. It just so happens that the first value that it gets is 0. So it does not go all the way up to 5. It stops at the number before. So again, that is an example of range taking one argument. If it has one argument, you start at 0, go all the way up to whatever that number is, minus 1. You can also give range 2 arguments, and this is the case of the previous example where we had for num in range 1, 11 to print the numbers 1 through 10. So if you give range 2 arguments, it will start with the first argument, whatever it is. So in this example, it's 1, and then it'll go up one at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it's the same rule as before. The second argument, in this case it's a 5, it goes up to the 5, but it does not include the 5. So again, if you have for n in range 1, 5, that will give the variable n the values 1, 2, 3, and 4. not 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's start and stop minus 1, essentially. Alright, and then your last option is to give range 3 arguments. Alright, so if you give range 3 arguments, so for example, 4n in range 1, comma 5, comma 2, what this does is it'll start at 1, it'll stop at the second argument, which is 5, except it stops at the one before for the same reasons we talked about before. It does not include that stop, it stops at the one before. And then the third argument is the skip. So in these two previous examples with 1 and 2 arguments, each time we went up to a new number, we just went up by 1. You can change that if you want. So let's say you want to do every other number instead. You could give it the skip 2, so you can give it the third argument 2. So in this case, 4n in range 1, comma 5, comma 2. We start at 1, we go up to 5 but not including 5, and each time we go up by 2. So the first value n will get is 1, the next one will be 3 because we go up by 2, and then there is no next one, right? Because 3 plus 2 is 5, and again the rule is you do not include that second number. You go all the way up to it, but you don't include it. If you are more math inclined, this might make slightly more sense. So again, if you have one argument for I in range x, that will give the variable I the value 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to x minus 1. Right? Does not include whatever that number is. If you have two arguments, say x and y, that will go through the values x, x plus 1, x plus 2, all the way up to y minus 1, does not include that y. If you have three arguments, x, y, and z, remember with 3 it's start, stop but not include, and skip. So in this case you do x, x plus z, because remember the z is how much you're going up by each time, x plus z, and so on all the way up to the number that is going to be closest to y but not including y. So I know this is a lot of new stuff. We'll do some examples, and I think it will start to click a little bit more once we go through examples. So one thing that I do want to point out is that for loops are what we consider a count-controlled loop. We call them count-controlled loops because we know in advance how many times they're going to run, how many times the for loop will iterate. So the word iterate basically just means run each time. So again, for example, if you have a for loop that's for num in range 5, num is going to get the value 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 each time it iterates through, which means we know beforehand it's going to run 5 times. So a for loop is a count-controlled loop because you can count how many times it's going to run before you even run the code. While loops are not count-controlled loops, so just sort of keep this in mind, especially when we talk about while loops in the future. But again, for loops are count-controlled because we can determine how many times they're going to run before they actually run. Alright, as promised, let's do some examples. I'm going to work through a couple examples with you, and then we'll do the thing where, I pause the video, have you work through it, and then I'll show you the answers. So when I do any code trying to figure out by hand what's going on with for loops, guess what I like to do? I like to draw pictures. Alright, so let's go ahead and draw our pictures. And now this time it's going to be a little bit different because we are still working with a variable, which means we're still going to have a variable box drawing diagram. So we'll still have something that looks like this. But the thing that's different is that we're going to get different values each time the loop goes for this variable. So what I like to do is I like to just sort of keep track before I even start running the code. Let's just make a note of what these different numbers are going to be. So let's make a note of the sequence that this range is going to produce. So again, the rule with range, this one has one argument, so that means we start with 0. Next number is going to be 1. Next one will be 2. And then we stop. Remember, you do not include this 3. So we're going to go through 0, 1, and 2. And then again, the idea behind for loops is each time this loop iterates, this code will run with the next value in this sequence here. So at the very beginning, we're going to start off with num having 0 in it. So I like to keep this sort of arrow down here just to sort of keep track of how far I am in the loop. And then I'll go ahead and update this value. 0 is inside num right now. So num is 0, and we print num. Cool. That's where this 0 comes from. Then we go up and do the loop again. So again, the whole idea with loops is that we keep repeating stuff. So we did one loop, one iteration, where num is 0. So now I'm going to go ahead, move this arrow over. Now we're on this number, 1, right? So I'll go ahead and update this to now have 1 in it. And we do the same thing. We print num, so we get 1. Move the arrow over again. So now we're at 2. So then we put the value 2 into our variable named num, and then we run the code that's inside the for loop again, print num, so we print 2. Cool. Not too bad. Alright, let's do the second example together too. So again, I'll go ahead and draw my little box. So this time the name of the variable is val. Cool. And then before I even start running the code, I'm going to make a note of what this sequence is going to be, the sequence that's generated by this range statement here. So again, the rule is if there are 2 arguments, it's start and then stop, but not including. So we're going to start with -1. Next value will be 0, then 1, then 2, and that's it, right? Remember, the rule is we do not include that 3. Alright, same thing with that arrow. We're going to start here. So val starts with -1. We go ahead and do all the code that's inside the for loop. In this case, it's just printing val. Cool. So that prints this -1. Cool. So we're done. We go back up to the top, run the loop again. So again, go ahead and move over your arrow that's sort of keeping track of where we're at. So now we're at 0. Which means val now has the value 0 in it. We print 0. Cool. And then we keep going, right? I'm not going to draw the arrow for the rest of them, but you get the idea. We keep going 1, 2, and so on. So that will print the numbers -1, 0, 1, and 2. Cool. Alright, go ahead, pause this video, and do this one on your own. This one's a little bit trickier because it has the 3 arguments, but I have faith in you. You can do it. Go ahead and pause the video and then unpause when you're ready to see the answers. Alright, so again, with 3 arguments, it's going to be start, stop but not include, and then skip. So the first value that's going to come out here, y, the first value you're going to have for y is -2, because we're starting at -2. That's the start right there. That's the first argument. Alright, now the skip is 2, which means each time we iterate the loop, we're going to give y a new value that goes up by 2. So the next value that y is going to get, starting at -2, add 2, so you get 0. Awesome. Then you keep going up by 2. So the next one will be 2, then 4, then 6, then 8, and then we stop, right? Remember, we do not include the 10. It's start, stop but not include, and skip. So be careful about That's stop, but not include argument. Be careful about that. Alright, got another one for you. Alright, so again, same deal. Go ahead and pause the video, work this out on your own, and then unpause when you're ready to come back and see the answer. Alright, so you can go backwards in for loops. And the way you do it is you have a skip. So you have a third argument that's some negative value, and then you start with a number that's higher, and then you end with a number that's lower. So in this case, same sort of idea. The start here is 10, so the first value is 10. The skip is -1, so we're going down by 1 each time, which means the next one is going to be 9, then 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and that's it. Remember, you do not include that stopping number. We do not include 1. So again, this is how you can go backwards with for loops. You have your start be higher than your stop, and then you have your skip be a negative number. It's pretty cool. Alright, let's do some more complicated stuff. So again, go ahead and pause this video, work this out on your own, and then we'll come back, I'll show you the answers, and then we'll walk through how to do them together. Alright, so for this one, hopefully you got these values. If not, don't worry, we will go through it in a second. Alright, let me give you one more, and then we'll go through solutions for both of these together. So go ahead, pause this video, come back when you are ready to see the answers. Alright, let's go ahead and work through both of these together. So these are two separate programs. They look really, really similar, but the indentation of that print statement makes a difference. Alright, so let's go ahead and work through both of these together. Let me go ahead and make a new file here. Alright, cool. So, let's work through this first one first. So we have a couple variables here. Our first variable is result. So we'll go ahead and draw our box for results. Now this is just a normal variable and we give it a value right away, so I'm just going to go ahead and put that value right there. Alright, cool. Then we have a for loop, which means we need to sort of treat this variable a little bit differently, right? So we have num, and let's talk about the sequence that num is going to go through. So this is a range statement, range function call. It has one argument, so we start with 0, then we do 1, then 2, and then stop. Remember, we don't include the 3. Alright, and then we go ahead and we start at the 0. So at this point in time, num is 0. So then we go ahead and run through all the lines that are indented underneath the for loop. So this for loop has 2 lines that are part of it. So each time we run through this for loop, we have to do both of these lines. So the first time we do, this is an assignment statement. We do the right hand side first, and then we put it into the left hand side. So we do this right hand side first. Results right now is 0. Num right now is also 0. So we get 0 plus 0, and we put that into result. Well, results already got 0 in it, so not super exciting. Alright, and then we print whatever result is right now. So at this point in time, result is 0. So that's where this first 0 comes out. Cool, so that is one iteration of the loop. So now we go back up to the top of the loop. We go ahead and move this arrow over. So now we're at 1. We'll go ahead and erase that 0 and put in our 1. And we do basically the same thing, except now num has a different number. So we'll go ahead and go into the loop. We have 2 statements here. Same idea, assignment statement, do the right hand side first. Result right now is 0. Num right now is 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. So we're going to put 1 into result. So let's go ahead, update this. This now has 1 in it. Cool. And then we print result. That's where this 1 comes from. Cool. That was another iteration of the loop. Now we go back to the top of the loop. We check where we're at in our sequence. Go ahead and move our arrow over. So now we're at 2. So we'll update the value that's stored inside num to be this integer 2. And we go and do the loop again. Alright, so assignment statement, result equals result plus num. What is result right now? Result is 1, and num is 2. So if we add 1 and 2, we get 3. So this whole thing right here, this right hand side, this is 3, stored into result. So let's go ahead and update this. Cool, result now is 3. We print result, out comes this 3. Awesome, we're done with this iteration of the loop, so we go back to the top. But that's it, right? Because we ended at this 2. There's no more numbers right here. There's no more numbers there. So we're done. 0, 1, 3. Cool. That's the first one. So let's talk about the second one. So again, the difference between this first one and the second one is this line right here, this print results. This line right here is not indented. Right here it is indented. So because it's indented here, that means it's part of the for loop. So every single time this for loop iterates, every single time it runs, we have to do this line of code. Here, it's not indented, which means the for loop is just this. So all of this is the only line of code that will happen each time we run through this for loop. So every time we run through this for loop, all we do is this assignment statement. We do not do any print. Once we're done running through all the iterations of the for loop, then we go down to this print. So we only do this print once because it is outside of this for loop. And at the very end of this for loop, we saw in the previous example, result is going to be 3. So when we say print result after the for loop is done, it's just going to print the integer 3. So this is a good example of why this indentation matters. Again, in this example, this highlighted code, that is the entire for loop. In the second one, the for loop is just this part. If you have any questions about that, do let me know. Alright, let's do one more example. So again, work this out on paper, pause the video, come back when you're ready. Alright, so with this one, the first number you're going to get, well, the first line you're going to get, I should say, is 7 and 10. Next line, 5 and 11. Next one, 3 and 12. Next one is 10. Let's go ahead and run through this together just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So let me go ahead, make a new file. Alright, cool. Alright, we got a couple things going on here, right? So let's take it step by step. We'll do our normal variable box drawing diagrams to help us sort of keep track of everything that's going on. So we have a variable num with this first line. This is just a normal standard assignment statement. That's 10, cool. We have another variable val, another standard assignment statement. We give it 0, cool. Then we had a for loop. So we're going to treat this variable similarly, except now we have a sequence here. So we have item, and let's talk about the sequence that item is going to get. So looking at this range, this range function call here, we have the case where it's 3 arguments, so it's going to be start, stop but not include, and skip. So we're going to start with 7. The next number we're going to get, the skip is -2, so we're going to go down by 2, so the next number will be 5. Next one will be 3, and that's it, right? Because if I went down again, we'd get 1, but that's too far. We don't go past this 2. Alright, so this is the sequence that the variable item is going to go through. We're going to start with 7. Alright, so now that we're all set up, let's go ahead, do our first iteration of the loop. So again, the stuff that's part of the loop are these 2 lines here because they're indented. So, first line of code, print statement, we are printing 2 values. We first print item, which is 7, right? Item is 7 right now. That's where the 7's coming from. And then we print the result of num plus val. Num is 10, val is 0. So that's going to be 10 plus 0, which is where this 10 right here comes from. Cool. Alright, next line of code. We're still inside the for loop because this is indented. We have an assignment statement. So again, assignment statement, do everything on the right hand side first. Val plus 1. Val right now is 0. 0 plus 1 is going to be 1. So this whole thing right here is 1. And then we put that into val. So we'll go over here and update val to now have 1 in it. Cool. Alright, and that was our first iteration of this loop, right? There's no more code to do in the loop because there's nothing else indented here. So now we go back to the top. We move this arrow over. So now we're at 5. There we go. Now we're at 5. And we're going to do the same thing again. We'll go into the loop. We'll do these 2 lines of code. So let's do this first line first. So we first print item, which right now is 5. That's this 5 right here. Then we print the result of num plus val. Num is 10. Val is 1. 10 plus 1 is 11. That's where this 11 comes from. And then the next line, assignment statement, do the right hand side first. Val right now is 1. We add 1 to it, so 1 plus 1, that's 2. And then we're going to put that into this variable val. So let's go ahead and update val to now be 2. Cool. Alright. Then we're done with this iteration of the loop, right? No more indented lines. We go back to the top. Alright, so we go back over here. We go ahead, move this arrow over. Now we're at 3. Item now has 3 in it. And let's do the loop again. Alright, first line of code, print item. Item's 3. There's the 3. Print num plus val. Num plus val, that's going to be 12. There's the 12. Val equals val plus 1. Val is now going to be 3. Cool. Alright, that was that iteration of this loop. We go back to the top, but then we see, oh, there's nothing left. We've already done the last number here in the sequence, so we are now finally done with this for loop, which means now we can finally go to this print statement where we print num, and right now num is 10, so that's how we get this 10. Alright, I encourage you to take the time to pause this video and type this out, type out this program. So this is a program that has sort of more workings of, a legit program rather than just these smaller examples that I'm giving you. So go ahead and open up idle, make a new file, and type this up and go ahead and run it. And I recommend when you run it, try to guess what it's going to do first. And then if you want, go ahead and add some more function calls to this function show squares up to, and try it with a different number. Try it with a number other than 20 and see what happens. But the key sort of takeaway from this example is, one, I want you to practice writing for loops yourself. And two, just sort of keep in mind that for loops, this is something that now you can add into code that we've talked about before. This is a new thing you can do. So you can throw it into a function if you want. You can throw it into a program that has multiple functions. One of them is a main function which calls another function which has a for loop. If you do have any questions about how this code works, feel free to let me know.